Early morning at JFK International Airport unfolded in a misty pale gray, as if the sky itself was still undecided between night and day. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the towering glass walls, bouncing off the cold marble floor and catching scattered footsteps of early travelers. Yet not a single soul truly noticed the presence of the young woman, walking slowly against the hurried tide. Maya Bennett, 26 years old, wore a simple black suit, slightly wrinkled at the shoulders, collar neatly fixed, and dragged behind her a navy blue suitcase that had accompanied her through countless unnamed meetings. Her face bore little makeup, only a radiant and resolute gaze under long lashes, look no longer of youth searching for a place, but of someone who had chosen her place and decided to hold it, no matter the cost. She stopped before the massive digital board, quietly searching for Flight 307. From New York to Los Angeles, not just a journey through the skies, but one paved with years of relentless effort, grasping every fragile opportunity so that today she could board first class as the CEO of Bennett Link, a young tech company now receiving its first $1 million offer from Starforge. Maya didn't smile, nor sigh. She simply took a deep breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the ticket that clearly bore her name. Seat 1 on. In her mind echoed her mother's voice from long ago. Maya, they'll come up with every reason to keep you from rising, but don't ever let anyone take the place you bled for. No one knew that just 3 years ago, she was still standing behind a coffee counter in Brooklyn, working nights at a dingy Italian restaurant, juggling school, student debt, and a rented room barely big enough for a twin bed and an old bookshelf. No one asked why the white shoes she wore today still had a scuff on the left heel, a reminder of the day she sprinted to a job interview, only to be rejected for not having enough management experience. No one knew, and Maya didn't need them to, because her presence in first class wasn't the result of pity or diversity quotas. It was built from skill, persistence, and a belief in her own worth, something she learned when every door once slammed shut in her face. When the boarding call echoed through the terminal, Maya stepped toward gate 12, presenting her ticket with a polite but firm demeanor. The check-in agent, a woman in her 40s, paused for a moment upon seeing the name and seat, but she said nothing, simply scanned the barcode and gave a faint nod. Maya accepted the return stub, thanked her, and proceeded toward first class, where soft golden lights fell over rows of pale leather seats, where silence prevailed, interrupted only by the scent of Arabica coffee and expensive cologne. Her footsteps were steady but unrushed. Eyes glanced at her, some curious, some skeptical, some pretending not to see, but Maya didn't let them distract her. She was no stranger to distrust. From being the only black woman in her Cornell economics master's class to meetings where she had to prove she understood more than the man in the tailored suit across the table just because she was 20 years younger and had no gray hair. Silence, to Maya, was not a place of fear but a space where she had learned to become unshakable. As she arrived at row 1 and sat in seat 1A, a distinct feeling swept through her, not pride, but something quieter, like the stillness of someone who had walked through a desert and preserved her dignity intact. She adjusted her seat, slid her bag beneath her feet, and pulled out her tablet to review the contract she was set to sign in Los Angeles. Each column of figures reflecting on the screen as though they were part of her own pulse. It wasn't her first deal, but it was the first she would sign as the face of her company, not as an assistant, not as a promising young talent, but as Maya Bennett, leader and rightful holder of her place. Outside the window, morning light slanted across the aircraft wing, casting silvery streaks across a sky gradually blooming blue. Maya remained still, her eyes fixed on that light, as if speaking to every past version of herself. Girl who once cried in the restaurant's restroom after being humiliated by a customer. The student who had a professor bluntly tell her, people like you won't likely run a company. Or the intern pushed aside so a less qualified male colleague could lead the presentation because he looked more like a leader. Those memories now lived only as silent slivers buried beneath the clarity of the present. Maya didn't know that within minutes, this first-class cabin would become a stage for an unnamed confrontation where outdated prejudice would crash against the unwavering faith of a new generation. But for now, she closed her eyes, breathed quietly, let her shoulders drop, and sank into the seat, letting the silence cocoon her like a safe chrysalis, because in silence, she had found her rebirth. In silence, she could see most clearly, she was exactly where she deserved to be. And this was only the beginning of a flight that would etch her name into the memory of an industry long thought unchangeable. First class was never loud. Passengers here rarely spoke up, let alone laughed out loud. The air seemed bound by an unspoken rule of restraint, as if the entire cabin had been steeped in subdued refinement, where even sound had to tread lightly with sophistication. But that silence wasn't peace. It was more like the surface of a lake right before rainfall, where silent glances alone could make one feel utterly misplaced. Maya Bennett felt it the moment she sat in 1A. Not from a word, not from an overt gesture, but from something invisible seeping in through the cracks of polite observation. The first glance came from a middle-aged man, and it lasted less than a second. But it evaluated, surprise, appraisal, then dismissal, as if brushing off an existence that didn't quite fit. An older woman in a beige suit looked Maya up and down from her shoes to her bag, then turned away with a subtle sniff, as if the air around her had just been tainted. Another passenger folded up his copy of Forbes, glanced at Maya with a blank expression, then adjusted his watch, as though to mark the time he was now wasting witnessing what shouldn't have happened. Maya wasn't surprised. She had walked into boardrooms where people paused when she entered, not out of reverence, but suspicion. She had sat in auditoriums where all eyes instinctively turned to the white man beside her, even though she was the speaker. But today, the silence in first class felt different. It didn't come from strangers who didn't know her. It came from people used to viewing others as puzzle pieces. If you didn't fit the picture they had built, you were pushed outside the frame. Morning light streamed in through the left window, washing Maya's face in a soft, uncorrected hue, casting shadows beneath her cheekbones and around her eyes. She didn't move, just scrolled through the contract. Inside, her heart no longer trembled. Today, she wasn't playing the part of someone hoping to be accepted. She was the one calling the shots. She read line by line with the focus of someone who had learned not to let the world control her breath. A flight attendant passed by, her eyes flicking briefly over Maya before stopping at 1C, leaning toward a man in a black suit to offer him champagne. No one asked Maya. She realized she was seen as an anomaly, a presence not yet explained. She didn't need attention to feel worthy. She knew every digit on her contract was worth more than all the Hermes bags in this cabin combined. Outside the glass, the tarmac was still veiled in a silvery mist, the airport wrapped in vapor. The plane hadn't moved, but inside Maya, something had shifted, not an emotion, but a sharp clarity. She was present in a space that others quietly believed she didn't belong to, and her presence, even in silence, was enough to shake the ground around her. An older man in the row behind slowly turned, deliberately letting Maya see he was watching her from over his newspaper. Not a word, just the gaze of a generation that believed seat numbers were earned by age and connections, not talent or grit. Maya didn't look back. She knew the real confrontation wasn't in speech, but in who would blink first in the silence. She even thought, for a moment, if she pulled out her phone now and fidgeted, they would take it as weakness, a quiet admission that her seat was a fluke. But Maya sat upright, eyes forward, looking at no one. She had once faced the scorn of a venture capitalist who asked if she even knew what EBITDA meant. She'd been asked during a pitch whether her company was backed by anyone reputable. She had received emails criticizing her signature as too sharp, not warm enough for a female founder. She learned not to respond with words but with outcomes. And now, she was answering them all simply by being here. When the final boarding call sounded, the first-class cabin settled into a soft murmur, couples whispering, magazine pages turning, seat buttons clicking. Maya closed her tablet, placed it in her bag, and leaned toward the window. Morning light had turned warmer, golden as the sun rose higher. But the cabin didn't change. Still the beige leather seats, the occasional echo of heels, an unnamed gazette quietly cloaking Maya like a fine mist. She didn't brush it away. She didn't resist. She let it remain, like a truth that had outlived her, and which she had chosen to step aside from. The quiet before the storm is often just that, harmless, until one spark ignites it all. Maya didn't know exactly when that spark would come, but she was ready, and with a steady breath, she closed her eyes not to sleep, but to steady herself in the rhythm of her own heartbeat, beat of resolve, of presence, and of a silent flame that refused to go out. The flight hadn't yet taken off, but the atmosphere in first class already carried the weight of an unnamed performance, each glance a silent spectator, and Maya, whether she wanted it or not, had become the lead in a play she'd never auditioned for. But that quickly became irrelevant. She didn't need to be chosen. She had stepped onto this stage on her own, with a silence forged from years in which nothing was ever handed to her. And within that silence, the only sound Maya could clearly hear was her heartbeat, steady, calm, unshaken, like water unfazed by wind. Then came the sound of high heels from the main aisle, measured, deliberate, as if each step had been weighed to announce authority. Overhead lights glinted off the polished leather of beige stiletto boots, and with that, like a presence that needed no introduction, a new figure swept into the cabin. Maya opened her eyes. She didn't need to turn fully to sense the shift in the air. No longer was it scattered curiosity, but a collective shift of eyes from every row, as if by ingrained habit. When someone important entered, everyone turned. The woman was in her 50s, platinum blonde hair pinned neatly into a bun, a tailored beige fur coat fitting her frame to perfection, a classic Chanel bag swinging from her arm. A diamond ring flashed cold on one finger, lips painted a sharp auburn red, and her posture erect as if every corridor she walked was a hall of honor. Beside her was a younger woman, Claudia Revesh, her private assistant, more modestly dressed, but her eyes sharp and alert like a silent bodyguard who knew exactly when to speak, and when only to observe. Patricia Whitmore, one of the airline's longest-standing elite members, owner of the prestigious Whitmore House restaurant chain in New York and Miami, a frequent name on investment boards, and a fixture of the old financial guard. Anyone who regularly flew cross-country had likely seen her at least once, and few had ever dared to sit in the seat she considered hers, 1A. Maya didn't move, her eyes still trained on the window, but she felt the two women stop directly behind her. A pause, brief, but thick enough to change the air. It wasn't confusion. It was surprise laced with disapproval. Then, in a voice low but loud enough to ripple through the already tense air, Patricia turned to Claudia and said, "There must be some mistake. Seat 1A is never a standby seat. That's for premier members. This can't be right." Claudia didn't respond, just flicked her eyes toward Maya, the glance thin and sharp as a blade, then nodded slightly, as if to confirm. Perhaps something was wrong. Maya hadn't turned her head, but she heard every word, every clipped syllable. She wasn't surprised, not angry, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when you see the sun setting behind a mountain. You know you'll have to climb. It's not frightening, it just demands readiness. Patricia stepped forward toward the front row, her expression tightening as she saw Maya more clearly. Her eyes swept over the simple black suit, the navy suitcase beneath the seat. Her lips curved not in a smile, but a tension barely restrained by decorum. Then she spoke, this time more directly, her tone measured to remain within the bounds of politeness but heavy with disdain. "Young lady," Patricia began, "I'm afraid there must be some confusion. Seat 1A has always been reserved under my name weeks in advance." Maya turned. She met the woman's gaze, neither defiant nor submissive. Her voice was low and even, like a still mirror. "There's no confusion, ma'am. I booked and paid for this seat over a month ago. This is my ticket, She held up her boarding pass, resting it calmly in her hand like irrefutable proof. Patricia glanced at it, but didn't touch it. Just a flick of her eyes before pressing her lips together. She didn't need confirmation. In her mind, Maya's presence in that seat was already wrong regardless of what the system or the facts said. Because the real rules Patricia lived by weren't written on paper, they were embedded in a lifetime of walking hallways where everyone simply stepped aside. Perhaps there was a system error, she said, turning to Claudia. These sorts of things happen more often now. The airline's clearly lowering its standards. Claudia nodded slightly, this time staring longer at Maya, not just evaluating, but trying to place her. Who is she? Why is she here? Maya remained silent, but within her, something quietly shifted, not a wound, but a recognition. This wasn't just a clash over seating. This was a moment when the remnants of an old system were trying to dictate who got to sit where, using only a gaze, and Maya, in her stillness, was the loudest refusal of that order. First class fell into a silence sharp as a blade. No one spoke. Some passengers glanced discreetly. Others turned away, feigning interest in newspapers, but their ears were listening. No one intervened. No one defended. No one asked, why should a ticketed passenger have to justify her presence to someone else? Why is silence so often the curtain behind which prejudice hides? Maya knew this moment wouldn't end here, but she wasn't afraid, because in her years of growing into herself, she had learned a vital truth. Sometimes, silence isn't surrender, it's the only way to hold on to your dignity when others want you to bow. And in seat 1A that morning, Maya Bennett sat upright, eyes steady, and met the first wave of resistance from the shadows of a world unwilling to let go, like stone in the middle of a storming sea. The air in first class on Flight 307 grew heavier, with Patricia Whitmore's seemingly civil, but fully loaded words. An invisible tension blanketed every passenger, no sound, except the gentle whir of the air conditioning, and the soft thuds of shoes adjusting on plush carpet. But the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the sharp kind, like when someone breaks something valuable in an old room and everyone pretends not to notice. Beckhouse, no one dares to speak up. Patricia remained standing, unmoved beside seat 1A. Her glassy, composed expression now flickered with irritation, not surprise anymore, but restrained indignation. Claudia stood with her arms crossed, eyes bouncing between Maya and the surrounding passengers, waiting to see if someone would recognize the issue and take her side. But no one did. A few kept their heads down in books. One man opened his phone and stared at the screen, pretending to check emails. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one wanted to get involved. Maya didn't move. She no longer looked at Patricia, not out of avoidance, but because she knew her gaze, if too direct, would be mistaken for provocation, and Maya wasn't here to provoke anyone. She was simply sitting in the seat she had chosen, paid for, and worked half a lifetime to deserve. She didn't argue, didn't protest, because loud resistance often reads as guilt to those in power. But silence, unshaken, composed, immovable, is what made those accustomed to control the most uncomfortable. Then came the sound of dress shoes, a flight attendant, approaching with urgency wrapped in courtesy. Greg Holt, head purser, neatly dressed, early 40s. A seasoned face topped with a practiced smile, arrived at row 1. He nodded politely at Patricia, then turned to Maya. "Good morning, ma'am," he began softly, his tone careful, meant to calm. "I'm the lead attendant for this flight. May I see your boarding pass again, just to verify something quickly?" Maya said nothing more, just handed him the ticket, her movements economical. Printed clearly on it, Bennett, M1, a priority boarding. Greg glanced down, scanned it, and hesitated. His face couldn't hide his discomfort, even as his voice tried. "Thank you. Yes, everything seems in order. But if I may ask, when did you book this seat?" The question, gentle as it was, cut like a blade. Maya looked straight at him, then answered slowly, "I booked it 38 days ago. Paid in full. I have the confirmation email if you'd like to see it." Her voice didn't rise, but the air around her seemed to thin. Patricia cut in, sharper now, with no more attempt at grace. "Greg, you know I always book 1A. You can check my previous bookings. Maybe there's been a system overlap, but we both know this seat isn't first come, first serve." She paused, then added, "Some passengers need to be prioritized." "She's young, she can adapt." That phrase "she can adapt" rang in Maya's mind like a velvet-tipped arrow. She'd heard it before, in meetings where people advised flexibility when her name was mispronounced, adaptability when her presentation was reassigned last minute, adjustments when she was pulled from projects for not fitting a brand image. The word adapt had once meant resilience. In this world, it had been bent into a tool to preserve the power of the privileged. Greg looked at my unapologetic, compromising glance. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "we have other seats available in first class like 3C or for 8th. They're quite comfortable. If you wouldn't mind, it might help resolve this smoothly." Maya cut in, her voice low and deliberate. "I mind." The cabin froze. She lifted her head, eyes locked on Greg. "I followed every procedure. I've done nothing wrong. I don't believe being young, or not looking like what people expect in this seat, is reason enough to be asked to move." Greg took a small step back, glancing around, meeting the eyes of a few passengers who were clearly watching. Maya continued, calm and steady, "If there's a system issue, I hope you'll look into it. But if not, then I'll remain here." Claudia cleared her throat, still silent. Patricia's face flushed a dull red, lips pressed tight. A woman a few rows back turned cautiously, saying nothing. An older man ducked further behind his newspaper, pretending not to hear. Greg retreated, leaving Maya behind in a space now thick with pressure. But within her, the weight didn't spark panic, it created clarity. She was standing at the edge between two worlds, one built on silent hierarchies, and the other made of her presence quiet but seismic. She knew, if she stepped back, the world would breathe a sigh of relief. A young woman yielding, a black girl knowing her place, an individual flexible enough to preserve collective comfort. But that was exactly why she wouldn't move. Because if she gave up the seat to satisfy an unnamed entitlement, how many more would be quietly removed tomorrow and never remembered? Maya closed her eyes and drew a deep, slow breath. Her palms felt warm not from anger, but from blood flowing stronger now. Like a bell tolling within her chest, there was no applause, no ally beside her. Only herself and the seat she had claimed, not with fame, but with undeniable worth. Maya remained seated in one, still, unmoved, like a landmark standing firm in the desert as the winds howled past. Every gaze cast in her direction felt like a scorching ray of sun, yet none could burn through the calm she carried inside. Movement in the first-class cabin seemed to slow. A space designed for comfort and serenity had become suffocating, not because of noise, but because of the tension from truths no one dared to voice. Greg had stepped away, but his eyes still held a flicker of unease, as if he knew he had just brushed against a boundary. He shouldn't have, not merely the boundary of a seat, but that fragile line between assumed authority and undeniable dignity. Patricia remained standing, her poise unraveling. Every second Maya didn't move was a silent blow to the long-held belief Patricia had about how society should function, that people ought to know their place, based on where they were born into. And in that silence, something strange was beginning to unfold. The delicate balance of the unspoken rules that first class had upheld for so long was starting to crack. Those who had once ignored Maya now stole glances. A man in his 60s holding the Wall Street Journal hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. A woman in a white fur coat, who had previously frowned at Maya's entrance, now stared blankly at her idle phone screen. Everyone was waiting not for an answer, but a resolution. Either Maya would withdraw, or she would be removed. One way or another, first class demanded its order restored. But Maya did not move. Inside her, her heartbeat pulsed evenly, like the ticking of a clock in a soundproof room. Not faster, not slower. She had long learned how to live in silence when she was overlooked in key meetings, when interviewers barely lifted their heads, because they assumed she was the assistant, rather than the founder. When questions were aimed not at her ability, but at her gender, skin color, and age. Today's silence was just another version this time, from seat 1A. Finally, Patricia turned, pulled her phone from her coat pocket, typed a message, then leaned toward Claudia, speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I've messaged the regional director. Someone will be here to handle this. We can't let reputation and loyalty be mocked like this." Her voice was cold, even, more like a political statement than a personal objection. Claudia nodded, eyes sweeping the cabin as if to reassure, "This will be taken care of." Maya heard every word but didn't turn. She knew that in first class, battles weren't fought with raised voices or crude words. They happened through glances, through comments light as feathers but heavy as stone, through the subtle poking of privilege that made the entitled squirm. And in these moments, the most dangerous thing wasn't open outrage, it was the fear in those who realized they were standing before something they could no longer contain. Greg returned after a quick exchange with another attendant, nodded slightly at Maya. He had clearly checked the system. "Ms. Bennett, we've confirmed your ticket is completely valid. Seat 1A was reserved under your name." His voice was quiet, as if each word was a pebble dropped into still water, rather than easing the tension. It made the cabin even more taut. Patricia straightened, adjusting the silk scarf at her neck, eyes flicking from Maya to Greg. "You're correct according to the system. But you and I both know this airline doesn't run solely on systems. It runs on relationships, on history, on loyalty from those who've supported it for decades. If we're now letting everything be dictated by cold digital codes, that's truly disappointing." Greg said nothing. He bowed his head slightly, as if caught between two forces on one side, the system on the other, the long-nurtured habits of hierarchy. But Maya knew the true choice didn't belong to Greg. It was about something larger. The definition the airline, or society itself, gave to the word deserving. She tilted her head slightly, eyes drifting toward the cabin door, then calmly retrieved her phone. No rush, no theatrics. She opened her contacts, selected a name, and dialed. One ring, two rings. Then a deep, steady male voice answered. Elijah Moore speaking. Maya didn't look at anyone. Her voice was soft, slow, composed. "Hi Elijah, it's Maya Bennett. I'm in the first-class cabin of Flight 307. There's a discriminatory situation unfolding. I need a public verification from the board." She paused, then added, "Not just for me, but for every young, different person who's ever been asked to step aside in silence." In the cabin, every sound seemed to vanish. Claudia narrowed her eyes. Patricia flinched, her face paling slightly. Greg looked up at Maya no longer with pity, but with a dawning realization. This young woman was not alone. Elijah Moore, a member of the airline's board, didn't hesitate. His voice rang clear. "Stay right where you are. I'll handle this immediately. No one has the right to take what you earned fairly." Maya hung up. No triumph, no smugness. She quietly slipped her phone back into her coat and looked straight ahead, like someone who had just lit a lamp in a long dark room, not to blind, but to force others to finally see. Silence, but no longer the silence of privilege. This was a silence that had just been shaken from its very foundation. The moment Maya ended the call, the first-class cabin fell into a strange new stillness, not the heavy silence from before, but something deeper, like an undercurrent beginning to swirl beneath the thick carpet. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Eyes still turned toward her, but this time, with a different tint. Not just judgment, there was calculation now, even fear. Fear of what had just happened. A young black woman had made the system confront itself. Without shouting, without slamming fists. Greg Holt, the purser, stood near the cabin door, still clutching his flight operations iPad. He was used to sensitive situation seat disputes, drunk passengers, even celebrities acting out, but never this. A quiet confrontation, with no one losing their temper, no one making a scene. Yet the pressure was mounting like a storm behind a blue sky. Patricia Whitmore hadn't taken her seat. She stood stiffly, hands resting lightly on her Chanel bag, eyes locked on Maya. Her face now wore an emotion unfamiliar to people used to power, helplessness. Though she held her regal posture, every breath, every swallow gave her away she was no longer in control. In her world, a phone call could change seats, attendance, even the atmosphere. But this time, the call came from the other side. Claudia Revesh, her assistant, stood with legs crossed, phone in hand, fingers trembling slightly. Her gaze darted between Maya, Patricia, and Greg. Eyes searched the room, scanning for the person who would break the fragile balance. But no one moved. Only a faint buzz from the intercom signaled to people aboard dignant passengers, but senior staff. Two individuals in navy suits entered the cabin. A tall, silver-haired man with steel-sharp eyes, Brandon Lee, Regional Operations Director, and beside him, Simone Parks, the firm yet graceful Director of Service Integrity, small in frame. Her presence was dense as metal. No introductions were needed. Their presence alone made it clear. Maya's call wasn't just noisy, it had moved the top. Brandon paused in the center aisle, scanning Greg, then Patricia. A short pause, just long enough to assess the scene. Simone opened her tablet silently, already noting observations. Greg stepped forward to speak, but Brandon raised a hand gently. "We'll be taking over from here," he said, voice steady, firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Patricia cleared her throat, trying to retain composure. "I meant no disruption. I just believe there was a misunderstanding. I'm a Platinum Elite member over 20 years. These matters, if picked up by the media, could tarnish the brand." Brandon didn't counter. He turned to Maya, his first direct look, then asked calmly, "Ms. Bennett, just to confirm, are you the one who booked seat 1A? Maya nodded. "Yes, sir. I booked and paid for it more than a month ago." All documentation was shared with the head purser. Simone glanced up. "System confirms full match. No discrepancies." Brandon nodded once. He turned to Greg and Denise. "Just Rivington said, you two, please join us in the internal coordination room. We need to debrief privately." Greg cast a quick glance at Maya, then bowed his head and followed. Denise, flight supervisor, was stone-faced, lips pursed, wordless. They walked past the rows like officers retreating from a front they hadn't realized had shifted. The door closed behind them, and in that moment, what everyone had felt, but no one dared to say, took shape. The old order had just been challenged, not with force, but with reasoned, unwavering presence. Patricia still didn't leave. She stood there, as if waiting for anyone else to want to defend her. But no one did. Claudia slowly stepped back, her hands loosening, accepting that something irreversible had occurred. In the end, it was Maya who broke the suspended silence. "I don't need privilege. I just want the same respect as any other passenger. The seating, not sitting in it to prove anything. I'm here because I worked hard enough to earn it." There's no statement louder than truth spoken gently. And in those words, denial was no longer possible. Maya wasn't just a young woman pushing back against bias, was living proof of something impossible to ignore. Justice doesn't have to shout. It just has to stand firm. Simone looked at Maya and nodded, a quiet gesture, like a vow exchanged without signatures, only trust. Then she turned to Patricia. "Speaking for the first time, Mrs. Whitmore, we'll issue a formal review of member seat prioritization policies. But today, the airline will not condone a paying passenger being asked to relinquish their seat simply because someone else has sat there before." Patricia stood still. No one came to her defense. No one rose to speak for her. And that for her was worse than defeat. Brandon concluded firmly, "You may continue your flight in seat 1B as arranged. But all seat-related disputes are now closed." He turned, walking away with Simone, leaving Patricia alone with the shadow of privilege just torn down behind her. Maya looked out the window. The midday sun now stretched across the wing. No one in the cabin spoke, but everyone knew they had just witnessed a shift, not noisy, Not violent, but a quiet swell, pulling an era away, an era where people like Maya were always labeled other. And now, that otherness had become the new measure of what a fair world should look like. After Brandon Lee and Simone Parks exited the first-class cabin, the door to the operations corridor shut with a soft but resolute click. That sound light as air carried the weight of something definitive, the divide between old and new, between invisible privilege and the quiet rise of fairness. No one in first class exhaled, but the air had changed. The cloud of entitlement, once thought as permanent as the gilded cabin ceiling, now bore a tear-small, but irreparable. Patricia Whitmore remained seated in 1B. Her posture was straight, chin slightly raised, hands gripping the handle of her handbag. But now, her commanding presence no longer felt natural. It had become forced, like a pose from a bygone era trying to cling to the present. No one looked at her with support anymore. A few passengers now glanced toward Maya, not with suspicion, but with quiet acknowledgement. One man gave her a subtle nod when their eyes briefly met. Another, avoiding eye contact, folded his newspaper with silent understanding. Claudia Reeves was no longer stationed behind Patricia. She had retreated a few rows back, her phone untouched, her voice silent. Her gaze followed every shift in the cabin, but her expression had softened no longer sharp. Perhaps even she had realized that something was shifting. The old rules where age, accent, or hairstyle dictated authority no longer guaranteed control. Maya still sat in 1A, leaning back lightly, shoulders relaxed, hands resting on her lap, eyes cast out the window where sunlight spilled across the runway like a golden ribbon. She didn't smile in triumph nor bask in satisfaction, because she knew this wasn't a victory. It was the first fracture, a crack in a system so deeply rooted that even her generation had been taught to doubt whether they belonged. She didn't need applause. What Maya needed was this silence, and it one of isolation, but of reflection, where those who once turned away might now begin to think. In that air, every minute passed like the slow beat of a shared heart awakening, not to pump blood for privilege, but for awareness. A new flight attendant had taken over, a woman in her early 30s named Ela, petite, gentle-faced, but with eyes that held clarity. She bowed slightly to each passenger, then stopped before Maya with a soft smile. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for standing your ground. We sincerely apologize for any discomfort you may have experienced. If you need anything, water, a hot towel, just press the call button." Maya responded with the smallest of smiles, light as a wordless thank you in her eyes. Ela saw something unspoken, a woman who chose to remain firm, not through protest, but through quiet depth, like an undercurrent steadily reshaping the shore. As Ela walked away, Maya reopened her tablet. The Starforge contract was still awaiting final review. She examined each clause, each figure, as if reading the story of her own growth. Not just numbers, but the rejections, sleepless nights, the doors she knocked on over and over. That contract wasn't just a business milestone, it was proof that a black woman with no inherited wealth, no connections, could still build what the world once said wasn't hers to claim. A soft ding sounded, signal that the aircraft was disengaging from the gate. Maya looked up. Outside, the pushback vehicle began to move, mechanical sounds humming beneath the cabin. Surface order was restored, but everyone knew something beneath had changed. From behind, a raspy male voice spoke quietly. "Your generation is going to make this world better." Maya turned. It was the elderly man in seat 2A, who had been silently reading throughout the flight. He didn't look at her, eyes still on the open book, but his hand had paused on the page. She didn't reply, just nodded barely, because sometimes the kindest thing is to let each other be in a mutual understanding that needs no explanation. Patricia sat still, wordless. Her silence no longer radiated power. It was the hollow quiet of someone who had realized the rules that once protected her were no longer absolute. Linda, middle-aged passenger who had once sneered no, glanced occasionally at Maya, no longer with disdain, not quite with support. But something in her eyes had softened as if she saw her own daughter in the young woman, seated up front. Maya noticed every glance, every quiet gesture, but she didn't take pride in it, because she knew the true journey wasn't about keeping a seat, it was about changing how people viewed who belonged in it. That seatney should never be labeled by skin color, age, or network. The plane began its ascent, the runway blurred behind like a fading memory, bathed in soft amber light. As the jet gathered speed, wind whispered past the windows, and Maya closed her eyes, not from exhaustion, but to breathe deep and long with no armor, no fear. She hadn't just kept her seat. She had forced an entire system to face what it preferred to ignore. When she opened her eyes, the city was gone. Only clouds remained white, soft, stretching wide beneath the wings, as if the sky itself was lifting her not because she was special, but because someone had finally dared to hold still in the right kind of silence. The landing gear touched gently on Los Angeles tarmac, ringing through first class like a quiet bell signaling return to Earth. But not just physical descent. For Maya Bennett, the feeling of the aircraft rolling along the runway didn't bring relief. It brought stillness, like stepping off an invisible battlefield where the defeated weren't bodies, but long decayed habits hidden in plain sight. The journey lasted over 5 hours, and Maya didn't sleep for a moment. She rewrote her contract draft, revised line after line, sent emails to her partners with additional rollout notes, all done in silence. The emotional tide inside her still simmering like coals beneath ash. No one in the cabin spoke. The silence was no longer about superiority, was about the collective realization that they had witnessed something they didn't yet have the courage to enter. Patricia Whitmore had said nothing the entire flight. Her face no longer bore the polished confidence of before. No one mocked her. No one scolded. But the silence in people's eyes, the coolness of the flight attendants, and the absence of her usual center of attention presence were louder than words. Her power hadn't been taken by force. It had been erased by a room no longer afraid to look elsewhere. Maya didn't look back at her, not out of disrespect, but because she didn't need to. She knew true change doesn't come from toppling someone. It comes when that person realizes, on their own, they're no longer untouchable. That self-awareness, that quiet, internal shift is the most lasting kind. When the aircraft came to a full stop, the seatbelt clicks echoed. Luggage wheels rolled from the overhead bins. No one rushed. No one pushed forward. It felt like each person was lost in something deeper than their schedule. Maya rose slowly, straightened her coat, picked up her bag, and stepped into the aisle. No urgency. She knew Nosh was no longer the one racing to catch up with power. Today, power had to adapt to her pace. A flight attendant stood by the exit, bowed gently, and whispered, "Ms. Bennett, thank you for teaching us a lesson in silence no one will forget." Maya said nothing. She simply nodded, with a quiet smile of kind that belongs to someone who knows the true worth of calm. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the warm air of the Southwest brushed her skin, carrying dust and dry sunlight of California. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply, and when she opened them, she walked as if crossing the spine of a shifting steady, upright. Without looking back, the car ride to Starforge headquarters was silent. Afternoon in Los Angeles moved past the windows like a film strip. Traffic lights, joggers, leaning palm trees. Maya didn't look out much. Her mind replayed faces, words, moments, each piece of that flight replaying in measured beats. She wasn't angry, just deeply aware that a shell had cracked, not without pain, but with necessity. Starforge headquarters appeared as a glass monolith, square, modern, transparent. Maya walked in wearing the same black suit from that morning. She didn't fix her hair. She didn't reapply lipstick. She walked in with her weariness, her clarity, her survival and hidden, unrevised. When she entered the boardroom, the executives were already standing, not for her title, but for something larger, respect for someone who had emerged from a moral storm. Without needing to raise a flag, the first to speak was the regional director, Ms. "Bennett, you're right on time, even though I know your flight wasn't easy." Maya sat down, opened her documents, and replied without complaint, "I'm ready to begin. The contract has been reviewed. I have some implementation suggestions for the East Coast rollout." No one mentioned the flight. No one asked about Patricia, the call, or Brandon Lee. But in their eyes, Maya could see, they knew. Not from news, not from email, but from the quiet spread of an ethical clarity. They hadn't expected to meet in a cabin like that. The signing went smoothly. When pen touched paper, no one thought it was just a business deal. It was a quiet witness to something greater, a new generation entering it with permission. Not with patronage, but with pure merit. As Maya stepped out of Starforge, the sun had dipped golden across the LA sky. Its rays struck the car window like memory, illuminating her face in refracted slices. She watched the sidewalk crowds and wondered how many people still held back, unsure if they had the right to keep their seat. She didn't think of herself as a hero. She didn't like the word. She was just someone who sat in her rightful place, at the right time, and didn't move when every pressure told her to. And she knew there were hundreds, thousands more in their own version of first class, where voices weren't raised, but dignity was taken with a look or a polite offer to relocate. Maya Bennett had landed, but the shift she started still soared Bay and JFK to lax. Beyond airline offices, beyond camera lenses, it was moving into boardroom corridors, closed-door meetings, and terminals where membership lists were still treated as eternal truths. And when some young passenger one day holds a boarding pass, standing in front of a first-class seat, wondering if they truly belong, there will be a voice in their head, not loud, not pleading, "If she did it, then maybe I can keep my seat too." Flight 307 had landed 3 days ago, but its aftershocks still rippled like a quiet tide through the inner corridors of Skylux Airlines. There was no press release, no viral video, no public scandal. Yet what transpired between seat 1A and 1B that day had seeped into every executive floor, every closed chat group, every internal bulletin. And when the name Maya Bennett began to surface in emergency briefings and leadership memos, the senior executives realized this wasn't merely a personal conflict. It had stirred something the airline industry had carefully sidestepped for years. On Tuesday morning, inside the 42nd floor glass-walled conference room at Skylux's Chicago headquarters, a closed-door meeting was held. 3 individuals sat facing one another: Regional Executive Director Brandon Lee, Senior HR Officer Eleanor Hayes, and a brand strategist from the Intangible Value Division. They said little. Instead, they read and reread the internal incident report submitted by Simone Parks, which included a brief summary. A young passenger was asked to relinquish her seat. She refused politely, firmly, and with such precision that no one could refute her. The system confirmed she was right. The crew was wrong. The bias was unmistakable. Immediate action recommended. Eleanor placed her coffee cup down, eyes pensive. "If this leaks, we won't just be accused of bias. We'll be branded as an institution protecting outdated power. And the younger generation will walk away." Brandon nodded slowly. She didn't yell. She didn't film it. She stayed in her seat, called the right person, and said the right words, and silenced the entire first-class cabin. That's the kind of resistance we never saw coming. Because it wasn't chaos, it was correct. The brand manager adjusted his glasses. Her name is already popping up in startup circles, policy commentary blogs, even private pilot forums. One flight attendant from that trip submitted a resignation letter, citing loss of faith in the current service structure. This isn't an incident. This is a signal. By the end of the meeting, they agreed to a historic decision: launch a full audit of the elite customer priority system, overhaul seat assignment policies, and most importantly, design a comprehensive retraining program for flight crews focused on equity, unconscious bias, and generational empathy. That same afternoon, the program was named See Me. Meanwhile, Maya Bennett had no idea that new policy drafts were being printed hundreds of miles away. She was seated in her Brooklyn loft office, bare brick walls, scattered strategy blueprints, partnership proposals across the desk. Her face was serious, not tense. She existed in the quiet, after a storm when life resumes its rhythm. But nothing about it is ordinary anymore. An internal message from Starforge had just landed in her inbox. The subject line was simple: contract signed, welcome aboard. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, not to verify the details, but just to confirm it was real. The same project she'd once been denied 3 years ago, citing lack of practical experience, was now set to become the strategic pilot program for the entire Northeast region. As she left her office, Maya received a call from Elijah Moore, her friend, her quiet ally on Flight 307, and a senior strategic officer at Skylex. He didn't ask how she was. The first thing he said was, "Thank you for not giving up your seat." Maya laughed a real laugh. "Light in the golden afternoon light. I didn't hold that seat just for me. I held it for everyone who's ever been made to feel they didn't have the right to keep what they earned." Elijah paused, then said, "The airline's about to announce major reforms, and they want you to open the launch event for See Me. They want you to tell that story in your own words." Maya didn't respond right away. She walked down the stairs, phone to her ear, eyes fixed on the sunset blazing across New York. In her mind wasn't applause or podiums. It was a memory of a 17-year-old black girl standing at a boarding gate, told that the seat she booked wasn't for economy passengers. That girl had stepped aside without a word, and from that day forward, Maya had made herself a promise: if she ever got the chance to walk in, she would never take a step back again. Her voice rang clear into the phone, firm, like steel forged in silence. "I'll tell it, but not to be honored. I'll tell it to remind them we never asked for privilege. We're reclaiming what was quietly taken from us." Elijah said nothing more, but Maya knew. On the other end, he was smiling. That night, Maya sat once again in the small room where she had first drafted the Bennett Link business plan. A desk lamp lit one corner, beyond the window. The city buzzed as if unaware of the quiet wars fought inside the human spirit. But inside Maya, something had shifted. No noise, no announcement, only truth and silence that no longer feared. That morning at JFK Airport, a soft veil of mist covered the glass facade of the international terminal. Morning light shimmered across the curved panels, like tissue paper hiding something waiting to be revealed. On the large screen in Concourse A, a message appeared in minimalist font: "Launch of See Me, a program to see the invisible below." In smaller letters, "Guest speaker, Maya Bennett." There were no banners, no red carpet, no upbeat music over the loudspeaker, but the space carried a distinct atmosphere, as if the aviation industry itself was holding its breath. Chairs arranged in a semicircle faced a simple wooden podium beneath soft white lighting. In the audience were not only Skylex executives, but also representatives from other airlines, anti-discrimination organizations, journalists from respected media outlets, and, unexpectedly, a group of randomly selected passengers from recent flights. They had arrived out of curiosity, but they stayed because something deeper was taking shape, something that didn't want to be drowned out by applause. It was the energy of transformation. Maya entered the space in a dark coat, hair tied back, no elaborate makeup. She carried no speech, only a presence, steady, quiet, as if she had already said what needed saying and now simply stood ready for others to listen. When she stepped up to the podium, the entire hall rose to its feet. No one asked them to. They simply did, as if to say, "We understand, this time. No one sits above anyone else." Maya placed her hands on the wood, not looking at the cameras or at any notes, but directly into the eyes of the people before her. Then, in a calm, low, clear voice, she began, "I'm not here to recount what happened on Flight 307, because it didn't begin on that flight, and it didn't end when I stepped off. It began years ago when I was a child standing at the end of a long boarding line. watching a flight attendant's eyes slide past me like I wasn't even there. And it continues every time someone asks me if I'm sure I'm in the right line, if I'm sure I've earned enough points, if I'm sure I belong in the seat I paid for. No coughs, no cameras clicked. The room was frozen in chosen silence. When I didn't give up my seat, I didn't do anything heroic. I simply didn't surrender what was mine. What I didn't expect was that my silence would echo so loudly. She paused. Her eyes never left the audience. In the front row, an elderly woman in a black sweater quietly dabbed her eyes with a tissue. No one noticed, but Maya did, and she understood. This wasn't a speech for media. This was a eulogy for a time when silence meant submission. We don't need more slogans. We need new ways of seeing. We need to redefine what priority means. Because if priority is only for those who look like the old standard, then it's not privilege, it's an outdated order. When Maya finished, there was no thunderous applause. Just a second unanimous standing ovation. Former executives, current leaders, once silent bystanders, all rosy as if trying to make up for something that had been overlooked too long. After the speech, Skylix announced the first steps of the CME program: elimination of rigid tier-based seat priorities, mandatory training for all flight crews on unconscious bias, passenger empathy, and equity, quarterly fair flights, where passengers from all backgrounds experience first-class service via public lottery teaching, mutual recognition through practice. Additionally, Skylix revealed updates to its new aircraft's first-class cabins, seats no longer named after cities or titles, but after those who once endured silently and held their dignity. Seat 1A on the first launch aircraft bore a new name, the Maya seat. No one called it an honor. Maya said nothing about it, but anyone who had followed the story understood. This was the airline's apology without needing to say the word sorry. 3 weeks later, a young flight attendant shared a short video online. In the clip, she panned across an empty first-class cabin, then zoomed in on the nameplate stitched onto the seat, the Maya seat reserved not for status, but for dignity. The background music was a soft piano instrumental. The video had no hashtags, no sponsors, but in 24 hours, it reached over 8 million views. And in a small school in South Bronx, an 11-year-old girl with brown skin and braided hair stood up when her teacher asked, "Who is someone you admire?" The girl answered, "Maya Bennett, because she taught me how to hold my seat even when the world says to step aside." The story didn't end with a closed door. It opened like a new flight path where voices don't need to be loud, just true, where silence is no longer surrender, but a choice of strength, and where dignity needs no permission to exist. The skies had begun to notice the faces they once ignored.